Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chapter 6 in our first video here on cost volume profit relationships. In this chapter, we're going to simplify the cost volume profit analysis, abbreviated CVP, that managers typically use when they adopt some assumptions with respect to these factors. One, the selling price is constant. The price of a product or service will not change as volume changes. Number two, the costs are linear and can be accurately divided into the variable component and the fixed component. The variable costs are constant per unit, and the fixed costs are constant in total over the entire relevant range. In multi-product companies, we have a mix of products that we sell, and that mix remains constant. Okay, let's take a look at this in a little more depth. First, we're going to calculate the variable expense ratio and the contribution margin ratio. Relatively easy to do. Here, our variable expenses are expressed as a percentage of sales and are referred to as the variable expense ratio. And here is that calculation. We take our variable expense and we divide it by our net sales. So the Racing Bicycle Company, RBC, sells 1,000 units with 200,000 in sales and 120,000 in variable expenses. The variable expense ratio, therefore, is 60% when we take the $120,000 and divide it by $200,000. Okay, now if we know the variable expense ratio, then we can actually subtract that from 100% to get to the contribution margin ratio. And the contribution margin ratio as a percentage of sales is referred to as the contribution margin ratio, and that ratio is computed by taking the contribution margin and dividing that by net sales. So in this case, the contribution margin for RBC will be $80,000. That's the contribution margin, and the total sales, net sales, or 40%. So that means that for each dollar that we increase sales, that's going to result in a contribution margin increase of 40 cents. A very important concept. Okay, so the contribution margin can be calculated by dividing that contribution margin per unit by the selling price per unit, and we'll get the same thing. Here, the contribution margin per unit was $200, and the selling price per unit was $500. Okay, so having defined the two terms, it bears emphasizing that the contribution margin ratio and the variable expense ratio can be mathematically related to one another, as I previously mentioned. The contribution margin is sales minus variable expenses. So if we take 1 minus the variable expense ratio, in this case 60%, we get the 40% contribution margin ratio. Okay, let's look at an application of this. If RBC increases sales from 400 to 500 bikes, so at $500 per bike, we multiply that times 100 increase in units, and that's going to be $50,000. The contribution margin will increase by 20,000. That is 40% of that 50,000. Okay, and so if we prove this, here's 400 units, and 400 times $500 per unit is $200. our variable expenses at 60% of 200,000 is 120,000, and our contribution margin is 40% of that contribution margin. And here we're breaking even. But if we increase it 100 units, sales goes up by 50,000. Variable expenses, of course, increase as well, and contribution margin goes up to 100,000. Less the same fixed expenses of 80,000, and we've made $20,000. And we calculated that by multiplying the $50,000 of increased sales by 40%. Okay, so the relationship between profit and the contribution margin ratio can be expressed as following. We take the contribution margin ratio times the sales, and deduct the fixed expenses. So in this case, we had 40% as our contribution margin ratio times $250,000 of sales at 500 bikes minus the fixed costs of 80,000 gives us our profit of $20,000. Okay, what that would tell management how much we would expect to make if we increased our sales volume by 100 units to 500 units. Okay, let's take a quick check. Coffee Klatch is an espresso stand in downtown office building. The average selling price of a cup of coffee is $1.49, and the average variable expense per cup is 36 cents. The average fixed expense per month is $1,300. An average of 2,100 cups are sold each month. What is the contribution margin ratio for Coffee Klatch? Okay, so I pop out my calculator real quickly, and I take $1.49, and I subtract 36 cents from that. That means my contribution margin is per unit is $1.13. So if I take $1.13 and divide that by $1.49, I get 0.7583. And so now, if I can multiply that contribution margin, let's try that again. I got $1.49 less 0.36 gives me $1.13 times 2,100. That gives me, okay, so let's take a look at what that looks like. And then I would deduct from that 1,300. Okay, let's see what that is. I'm getting answer bravo. Here, our unit contribution margin, right? That was $1.49 less 36 cents, as shown here, divided by the $1.49 sales price. And that gives me 0.758. Okay. Okay, now, same scenario here. What is the contribution margin ratio? We just did that one. Now, explain how changes in sales volume affect contribution margin and net operating income. Okay, here, the contribution margin statement is helpful to managers in judging the impact on profits of changes in selling price, cost, or volume. The emphasis here is on cost behavior. So here is our old example of the RBC and the sales at 500 units and our profit at 20,000. The contribution margin is the amount remaining from the sales revenue after the variable expenses have been deducted. So that's pretty easy to understand. We just went through that. Now, the contribution margin is used to cover fixed expenses. So any remaining contribution margin contributes to net operating income. You'll remember that originally we were break even at 400 units. And so then when we sold that additional 100 units, we were able to make $20,000. Okay, so the contribution margin approach. Let's take a look at this. Sales, variable expenses, and contribution margins can also be expressed on a per unit basis. So if racing sells additional bicycles for $200, additional contribution margin will be generated to cover the fixed expenses. So here are those calculations. We're basically dividing these totals by 500. Okay. Now, what we're going to do next, each month then, RBC must generate at least 80,000 in contribution margin to break even, which is the level of sales at which your profit is zero. And that's pretty easy to see here, because here I'm making 100,000. If my contribution margin was 80,000, as it would be with 400 bicycles sold, then my net operating income would fall to zero. Okay, so just like I said, here's RBC selling 400 units in a month. It will be operating at break even. Okay, everybody see that? All right, now if we sell one more bike, right, the net operating income is going to increase by $200. You see that here. That's because each unit sold generates a contribution margin of $200. Okay, important concept. We do not need to prepare an income statement to estimate profits at a particular sales volume. We simply multiply the number of units sold above break even by the contribution margin per unit. So if we sold 430 bikes, its net operating income is going to be $6,000. That's 30 units above break even at 400 times $200 per unit. Okay, everybody grab that approach. Okay, now the contribution format in the income statement can be expressed as the following equation. We take our sales minus variable expenses minus our fixed expenses, and that generates our net operating income. Okay. Now, the equation can be used here to show the profit RBC earns if it sells 401 bicycles, one bike above break even. Notice the answer of 200 is going to mirror our earlier solution here. So we take our profit, that's going to be 401 units times 500, minus our variable expenses, that's 401 units times $300 per unit, and then we back out our fixed expenses, which do not change with volume, of $80,000. And as you see, if I do that equation here and plug those numbers into the equation, I get $200. Okay. When a company has only one product, we can further refine this equation. And so the quantity sold times the selling price, and the quantity sold here times the variable expenses. That looks like a good place for us to stop this video, and when we return, we will continue with this slide. Until that time, bye for now.